Welcome to On the Soul's Terms podcast, a weaving of astrology, Greek mythology, and depth psychology. I'm Chris Skidmore, an astrologer, psychotherapist, and craniosacral therapist living in Ubud, Bali. Welcome to the show, and today we'll be doing our first of the archetypal oppositions. And I want to start with something poignant to the astrology at the moment, which is this Capricorn and Cancer full moon that is happening this weekend. So on the one hand, you have the sun, which is still moving through the very last degrees of Cancer, and you have Capricorn, where the moon is going to be on the other side of the spectrum. And all of these archetypal oppositions that we can explore through astrology give us a really great sense of the spectrums of experience that we're all in the big round, in the big circle of where we are. By putting a sign with its opposite sign, you can see the tension point between them. You can see how they don't get along in a lot of ways. You can see from one side's perspective what they think of the other side, telling us all of the sort of worst things that they see, throwing stones over the other side of the pond there. But then ultimately what we can see in the end is how if both of those archetypes can work together, then there tends to be a really dynamic ability to create through the opposites. It's like Jung talked about, the magical third thing is possible. And that's what we get to explore in this round, where we are bringing in many different types of archetypal oppositions. I'm going to be bringing in, for instance, soon I'll bring in the tension between Artemis on the one side and Aphrodite on the other. So it's not necessarily always going to be astrological, but I thought this week would be a good one to bring in that tensional point between Cancer and Capricorn. Now, to give you a sense of what this means, Cancer and Capricorn, they're both cardinal signs and they're both negative. Cardinal means they're fire starters, they get things going, they're more active, and negative means they're more internally focused than they are externally focused. So all of the fire and the air signs, they're more externally focused, so they're positive, and all of the earth and water signs, they're more internally focused, and so they're negative. Now, Cancer is a water sign and Capricorn is an earth sign. So always within astrology, water signs are opposite earth signs and vice versa. So the water, as you can imagine, is the feeling sense, the deep intuition, emotion, fluidity, and all of the things. You can keep going with words that you associate with water, and that is the watery element. So it's that deep interior emotional felt sense experience of the world. You can hear within that it's highly personal. It's a highly personal thing, subjective. Earth, on the other hand, is the very grounded, practical, sensible, logical world. It's connected to matter, but it also connects into the body itself, not necessarily through the feeling function of the body, but more the more physical structures. So Cancer, that is a water sign, is also ruled by the moon, by lunar consciousness. So really what Cancer is trying to do is to nurture, is to care, is to love, and is to bring its arm. It's like I'm doing this with my arms right now, really bring its arms around things and keep things contained, warm, and nurtured. That's what it's attempting to do. And of course, on the other side of that, those same hands that can be providing that care and that nurturance can also be restricting and constricting. I think we'll see both sides of Cancer as we go through here. Capricorn, on the other side, is a sign that is ruled by Saturn. So Saturn, in his rulership of Capricorn, is really the kind of planet that is able to make sacrifices and restrictions and hold back on certain things, have discipline, have the ability to get up day after day, setting really good routines, and as it is, the mountain goat as well is trying to climb up that mountain and get to the top sort of positions. Juxtapose this to Cancer over the other side, that is the crab. So instead of being up there on the mountain trying to make its way up, Cancer instead is down there at the sea, down between the sand and the sea. So you can see that they're both going in different directions. I did an episode once where I talked about Capricorn as progress and Cancer as regress, and this sort of sense of going forward and backwards between the two. Obviously, the mountain goat trying to get up the great hill is a symbol of progress and moving forward and moving up, and Cancer as the crab is regress, in that, the crab is one of the oldest creatures on the planet, and so it reminds us of this ancient part of the self. If we go a little bit further into that as well, Cancer as the crab has that soft underbelly and the hard shell, and always within that Cancerian consciousness, it's trying to figure out how much shell and how much underbelly, in a way, how much vulnerability, how much exposure. All of these are the questions that Cancer really faces. And meanwhile, over the other side, Capricorn, as that mountain goat, is steady and stable and sure-footed when it comes to the mountain. But also we have these other figures associated with goats, like we have the great figure of Pan, for instance, the goat god, who was musical, who could take people out into the forest and, playing his pipes and getting people into a state of sort of ecstasy. From Capricorn, we get cornucopia. So we have this sense of like there's a real abundance available in Capricorn, but it's known also for its holding things and its restrictions of things. So let's think about how we can put these two together, or maybe we could say, where does this exist in your inner world, and where can we find it in the world itself? Well, one of the really interesting places this exists is in the inner child. That would be the Cancerian experience. The inner child, like connecting and regressing back to that child that may need more safety, more warmth, more love, maybe a bit needy and a bit clingy. This Cancer energy of the child within. And opposing that to Capricorn, which is like the inner elder. And what we hope for when we put the inner child and the inner elder together is that they can help each other. The child is helped by the elder in that there's a steadying force, can help it understand the limits and what to do and what not to do, where how you can cross certain limits but not cross others. And that stern force that can be there to help the child remain in a safe kind of contained environment, and even set the odd limit that the child can actually cross over, and then set a new limit again that the child can kind of cross over to help that child grow and mature through life. Equally, the child offers something to the elder as well, in that the elder has already been through the hardest toiling years of life, and might need to, after all that kind of, all those battles and all those trials and tribulations of the middle part of life, it's like that elder can remember what it's like to be the child, and to be carefree and spontaneous and all those kinds of things that children are. In fact, the best elders, the most impactful elders are often those that have got that twinkle in the eye. It's like they've gained back the twinkle in the eye of the child. In Jungian terms, we call this the Puer Aeternus on the one side, that's the eternal youth, and the Senex on the other. And it's one of those things that has been really explored at length. There's books that I've mentioned in the podcast before by James Hillman and Marie-Louise von Franz, both of them going at these very different angles. And what's so fascinating about reading those books is that Hillman's really coming from more the Puer loving, or maybe Puer type of spirit inside of himself. And over the other side, you get that very Senex figure in Marie-Louise von Franz, who's kind of chastising the child all the way. But I think it's still very much a image, that Puer Aeternus and that Senex, and the battle between the two, the child and the old man, or old woman, as it might be. The tension point between the two, there's a chance for, I believe there's a chance for more elaborating on this, what could be, this really essential archetypal battle between the two. Now, if we put them in opposition to each other, these two, we can look at how that child may experience that adult or that elder as an antagonistic force. And so if we enter the stories, if we enter through the child, we can kind of see how this other force can be sort of tyrannical. One of the stories that springs to mind as I talk about this is in the Grimm brothers' Cinderella, as the child has lost her mother and gets a new mother. So the stepmother comes in, and this stepmother is a very Saturnian force in the really negative sense. The old devouring Senex, the one that wants to destroy the child and give it no chance in life. And so this is how Cinderella gets her name. She's called Cinderella because she's told to just be by the ashes, which is a symbol associated with Saturn, is the ashes. And her name, the cinders, even is a reference to being in these ashes. And so she's told she's really worthless. She can't do anything in the world. She's not really, she doesn't really have anything to offer except for sweeping up by the hearth all of the ashes that come every day, for doing the laundry, for doing all the cleaning, and for taking care of all of the tasks around the house, whilst the mother and her stepsisters, the mother's daughters, get to just do whatever they want. So this is a really good one in the tensional process that can happen, and the experience that the child can have in the face of that wicked mother archetype. There's a really good scene in Cinderella that I always go back to, where Cinderella really wants to go to the ball, the 3-day ball that's come into town, and she thinks she might be a chance to have a really good night and maybe even meet the prince. And so she goes to stepmother, and stepmother just laughs at her, scoffs at her, like, how would you ever imagine being able to go into the ball? Like, what delusion, you're completely mad and insane. There's no way. And so she's kind of pushed back into her ashes as she gets the dream to go out into the world and maybe go to the ball. And so in this scene, Cinderella's stepmother, she takes a bowl of lentils and scatters them in the ashes and tells Cinderella, if you can separate out the good and the bad lentils from the ashes in 2 hours, then you can go to the ball. And so it's a devastating thing, because of course she can't do that. But as she's sitting there crying and lamenting and feeling her ashesness all around her, and her dreams and her longings and desires to go to the ball, birds pop up, and they tap, tap, tap on the window. They ask to come in, and she opens the door, and they flutter in, all of these birds, and they pick away at all the lentils, and it's very easy for them to do that well within the time that she was given. And so she brings this back to the stepmother, this Saturnian figure. She brings it back to the stepmother, and the stepmother just scoffs at her again, gets double the amount of lentils, and gives it to her in half the time that she has to separate these lentils out into their good and bad and take them all out of the ashes. So again, it's like you solve the problem of the Senex, and then the Senex will sometimes just double it for you, because they really just don't have it in mind that they want you to go any further than you are. They want to be the limit. They want to be the edge. It's like, this is as far as you can go. But then, of course, the birds come back and they achieve it again. And so she brings back the bowls to the stepmother, saying very expectantly and very proudly, like, I did it. Now I can go, right? And then she just says, no, wrong. And that's the end of the discussion. We won't hear any more about it. So you could feel the unfairness on behalf of that child that really is looking to go to the ball, but she just cannot get through the stepmother. And then it turns out in that story, she has to take the window. She has to take the side avenue. So if you think about that in terms of Cancer and Capricorn, she has to take the lateral movement, and that's what the crab does, of course. It's never going direct at things, it's going laterally. And so the only way that she's going to escape the clutches of this devouring mother is to escape through the side door. You know, there's another way for her in this particular story. If we look at it from the opposite angle in the story of the Frog King, the princess has felt herself to be entitled to whatever she wants. She's playing with her golden ball by the dark forest. She doesn't care where she is. And when she drops the ball down the well and the frog offers what he offers, the princess is happy just to tell the frog whatever he wants. And then once she gets her golden ball back, just skip off back to the house. And so in this story, the king is the Senex who's trying to teach the princess that the deals that you make in the world, you have to stick by. Right, so this is very much the Senex looking back at the at that child Cancer, and kind of scoffing and like, you know, such an entitled princess who just thinks she can get whatever she wants. Like she doesn't know hard work, she doesn't know how to, you know, roll up her sleeves, and this is the kind of attitudes. And so when the frog comes to the palace, she looks to her father, and the father says, "Well, you make that deal in the world, and you have to stick by it." I think we can also all see from the Senex's perspective there that the child needs to learn a particular lesson. But there's an interesting tension point in the story of the Frog King, because at first, you know, the first agreement that she's made with the frog is that he should come into the house. And so, you know, obviously the dad is there, the king, and he's able to be there around it. And he's like, well, you made the deal. Now you have to have a frog sitting next to you. That's just the way it is. And then the frog's like, okay, cool. They set up a whole plate and everything for the frog. He says, no, this isn't the deal. Because the second thing she agreed to is that he should be able to eat from her golden plate. So this is a little bit of a line ball for me as far as the conversation between the Senex and the Puer. Because the Senex in this case, the Saturnian figure, it's now like, well, has she learned her lesson from the frog coming in, or does she have to learn the lesson of now the frog eating from her plate, from her golden plate? It would be pretty disgusting to have a frog eating from your golden plate. The king enforces the original statement and says, if you make a deal in the world, you have to stick by it. And so the next phase happens. The last agreement from the frog was that he could share the princess's pillow. And now that's one bridge too far, isn't it, if you think about fairy tale language? And now you're in the position where you have the Saturnian father figure and the lunar figure of the girl or the child. And you have to ask, at what point is the father instinct to protect the child going to override the desire to uphold the rules of the land? I find it to be a very interesting tension point that sits in this story. And perhaps that's why the Grimms always had this as the number one in their collection, because it's such a great story that explores so many different things. In this story, we see a Senex figure, a Saturn figure that doesn't really have an understanding for his role as also a protector, not just enforcer of the rules. And so he enforces the rules again, and the princess picks up the frog and brings it upstairs with her two fingers. So now he has basically opened the door for a frog to be in her chambers. Not much of a position. But then we get that moment, that classic moment that I've talked about quite a lot. I even did an episode of the podcast on it, where she finds her inner authority and she reaches down. It's like she's reaching down into her own soul, into her own sense of what is okay and what's not okay, what she'll accept and what she won't accept. And she almost like this child, this lunar figure, finds her own authority. And she grabs that frog, throws it against the wall. You odious, disgusting frog. Basically saying, no more. This is my limit. And so in a way, that's how she grows up. That's how she becomes the queen, is because she's able to say no of her own accord. So we could say there in fairy tale language that in some ways the king has helped her to find her own limits. But there is also a part that says, well, still he is the king and he is the father. So I'm not so sure if it's all that, all that kosher, that kind of a move. Anyway, as we go forward, so we're looking at the inner child and the inner critic. That's also another good way to look at this. So we all have inside of ourselves that inner critic, that voice of society, or that voice of, sometimes it's good to just find out, like, what is the accent of the voice? Who is the inner critic? Can you give it a name, or can you give it a bit more personification so we can really deal with it? But it's part of the human condition to have that critic inside, telling us what we can do and what we can't do. And then we also have that child inside as well, that perhaps is thinking that the world should be more womb-like than it actually is, that I should be taken care of in the world in all these ways. Maybe the entitled one, or the bratty one, or the narcissistic one, or whatever it is. And so you can hear within this that the two voices really need each other. That's why when I'm talking to somebody about an inner critic, I always want to, firstly get to know who is this inner critic, and then secondly get to know who's the one that gets picked on inside, from the person's perspective, and then explore both sides of this. Explore the side of Saturn, the side that's being a bit mean and a bit cruel, maybe this kind of overlord figure of the Psyche, and then explore the little one inside too, that feels like there's a overpowering, towering kind of essence coming at it, and it doesn't know what to do in the face of it. Earlier in the podcast, I also talked about Pan, and Pan being the other side of Capricorn consciousness. I've really talked about that quite a lot on the podcast, and others have talked about this too, because of course we consider Capricorn to be this very stern, very Saturnian sign, but that's not always the case. I think in all of our experiences, we'll know some of that Capricorn energy. If you pay attention to the archetypes behind astrology, and the archetypes behind the people that you know, and even within yourself, you'll know some Capricorn types that are very stern and very serious and very much like in that Senex Saturnian place. But you'll also know a lot of Capricorns, I'm sure, strong Capricorn energies that are very fun, very wild, and very free, much like Pan playing his pipes and bringing the merriment and bringing the joy. And so I feel like within the Capricorn archetype, there really is that too. And then within Cancer, you'll have that really wise, really solid feeling type, somebody that's got a lot of heart and a lot of soul, able to really listen and pay attention. And you'll also have that very emotionally immature Cancer type as well. That's very touchy, very sensitive, and very crabby, we could say, with the crab claws. I was thinking the other day about Cancer that if you feel across your chest and then up through your arms and then out to your hands, you can actually feel that crab that sits on your chest and goes all the way out to your hands. And if you put your hands in a kind of pincer form, you can see that thing as a whole crab really across the chest. So I think that's kind of where the crab lives, on the exterior, like as the exoskeleton. So one of the ways I think that the archetypal opposition is explored, or one that I've found, is actually in the story of Psyche and Eros. And this is a story I'll be discussing with David Russell. Dr. David Russell's coming back on the podcast. And next episode, he'll be talking about the story of Psyche and Eros and how it can help us with our own psyche and working with the psyches of others as well. It's a really beautiful conversation. I look forward to bringing it to you. But meanwhile, let's come back to an image that comes from that particular story that I think is very powerful. When Psyche throws herself into the river, so this is when the whole palace is gone, she's washed up on the shore and Pan is there. He's playing his pipes and Echo is there, and they're just having a grand old time. And Pan is able to just listen and hold space and just be there for Psyche. And especially as she's coming out of the water, you can get this beautiful way that the Capricorn elder of Pan is able to sit with the child of Psyche and just be there as a steadying force. And I find that to be a really beautiful illustration of the way that these two energies can come together so beautifully. But then I also noticed that later in the story, when Psyche has to make her journey to the underworld and back, she goes across the river Styx, and the tower has given her the instruction not to save the drowning man. And so that's a really interesting one where Psyche has now grown up. You know, she's gone through her tasks and she's gone through what she needed to go through. And now, rather than the child, she's now becoming like that elder figure. She's now becoming more of, like, she's built into herself. If she was Cancer at the beginning, she's built into herself more of the Capricorn. And then when she sees this very negative Cancer energy, which is drowning, the drowning man, you know, it's actually a corpse floating down the river Styx who will reach out for her hand. And she's given the instruction not to reach out for him, not to let him back in the boat. I find this to be like the other side of the Pan and Psyche connection is Psyche and the drowning man, you know, and Psyche needs to acknowledge that if she reaches down now, if she shows that kind of compassion at this point, that Cancerian caregiver at this point, she's going to just be drowned. So she has to move into a more Capricornian stance in that she has to resist the urge to help at this point, at this task. If she was to help, then she would actually be to hinder, and she's just going to get dragged into the river Styx, and she needs to know that. And so that's a really beautiful one of knowing what the limits are, when to set a limit, when that kind of care and that nurturing is actually not useful anymore. It's not helping the person to grow, and it's clearly not going to help that dead man in the river Styx to grow, and it's clearly a trap set for Psyche. So I find that to be a really good illustration of how Cancer and Capricorn energy, they can come together and they can form that magical third thing. Like, Psyche is still very useful in this story, but she's also now gaining wisdom. You know, the next thing she's told is that the three fates, the sisters of fate, they're going to ask her to come and join them, and she has to say no. So that's also like the Saturn, the Capricorn. No, I'm not going to do that. Setting a limit. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to start to try to weave my own fate, which means she's not going to get into the hubris, and she's going to let her fate unfold in front of her without trying to take control of it. We also see illustrations of Cancer and Capricorn in the story of the Handless Maiden, which is a classic Grimm Brothers tale. In this story, there's a miller, and he's down in his luck, and you know, he's just working the mill and it's not working out for him. He's not getting enough money to get ahead. And so he goes out to the forest to start cutting down trees because the mill just isn't providing for him anymore. Out in the forest, he sees an old man, and the old man says, look, I'll give you all the riches that you can imagine, and all I want in return is whatever's behind your mill. And the man thinks about it. What's behind the mill? And he thinks it's just the apple tree that the old man is referring to. So he says, you know, all these riches for just one apple tree. Yeah, I'll take it. Takes the deal, shakes his hand, and then he goes back. And when he gets back that evening, the wife comes out. She's like, what's going on? There's riches everywhere. He's like, oh, hooray. Yeah, the old man in the forest, you know, he's given us all these riches. So just for that silly apple tree, he'll be back in 3 years to claim it. And the wife is very suspicious, like, hang on, what did he actually say? And he said, well, he just said, you know, whatever's behind the mill. And then the wife is devastated. She's like, oh no, what was behind the mill was our daughter. And so we get this situation in this story that effectively, you know, for that Capricorn struggle and trying to get ahead, it ends up that the Cancer, the lunar consciousness, is as the feeling function in a way is actually sacrificed. And so what happens in this story 3 years later, you know, the devil comes for this child, and but she's washed herself clean. She's drawn a circle around herself so it can't get to her. So then he has to go, but on his way he says, hey, take away all water. So she so I can take her next time. Takes away your water, and then she still cleanses herself with her tears. So you can hear the emotion and the water and the feeling function that runs through this story so far. And then the devil, because he still can't get her, says, cut off her hands so that I can take her next time. Then she won't be able to purify herself if she has no hands. And so the father does just this. And that's where we get the sense of, again, the Senex in this case being the devil or the father, two sides, just like the witch is the negative side of the mother, the devil is the negative side of the father. In fact, you can even see that in Capricorn with this god Pan, because in the modern day when we think of Pan, the goat, the horned one with the hooves and everything, the goat man, we actually immediately think of the devil. So somewhere along the line, there was a poet in the 2nd century that declared that Pan was dead, and maybe he went down around that time into the underworld and became the devil. But it's a curious thing how that happened. But we can see the negative side of the father is the devil, the negative side of the mother is the witch. And so in this sense, it's the devil that is able to take away, essentially take away the feeling of the child, but it's also the father himself that participates in that. And ultimately, her feeling function has been sold. It's been sold for gold, for riches. Even at the start of this story, there is the mill, which is trying to make water into profit. So interesting symbols throughout. The story goes on. In the end, she goes to the next town and she gets these silver hands. A king falls in love with her and gives her silver hands. And it's an interesting symbol, the silver hands. Because on the one hand, silver is the metal of the moon. We can hear some form of lunar consciousness coming through. But of course, silver hands are also pretty useless, aren't they? They're cold. They can't bring that warmth, that nurturing, that care. They can't really do anything. They're really ornamental. So it looks like they're lunar, but they're not actually lunar. And so it forces the maiden through a few more tricks of the devil. It forces her back out into the world. And then eventually, and I'm taking from the Russian version of the story here, she drops her child into the river and she reaches down. And as she's reaching down, her hands grow back in that moment. So, this act of nurturance, care and mothering, this lunar consciousness in its true form, plus reaching into the actual physical water itself, brings back that sense of the feeling function again. So we can see, this is an archetypal tension, so it's timeless. It's happening in all different times and in all different ways. It's happening in the microcosm and the macrocosm. It's happening within our family units. It's happening within ourselves. It's happening in relationship. It's happening between mothers and daughters and fathers and sons and the whole lot. Every combination you can imagine, it just happens within there. The Cancer Capricorn axis sort of occurs everywhere. But we can really see, maybe the reason that something like the Handless Maiden has gained such popularity, especially amongst Jungians, it really feels like a diagnosis of our times in a way. I'm thinking about when we want to reach out to someone now, what do? We usually reach for this cold black box and look in there for connection. Our hands connecting to the phone rather than reaching out and connecting to each other. We have some really crazy rules, in my opinion, in for instance, in a primary school or in a kindergarten. The teacher's not allowed to hug the students. This is in Australia and other places as well. The teacher's not allowed to hug the student. Even though it's kindergarten age kids, that just thrive off touch. In therapy, a psychotherapist isn't allowed to put their hands on the client because there's this idea that that's going to mean that someone's vulnerability will be taken advantage of. And I find it really sad because, yes, I know that happens. I'm not blind to the fact that that does happen both in kindergartens and with therapists, and that's a terrible thing. But I wonder if the solution to something like that is to just cut off our hands, just to cut off our hands so we don't do it at all anymore. To me, that's the kind of thing. It's like when we cut off the head of the Hydra two more heads come up. We think we're making this really intelligent solution, but it's so solar. It's like Hercules using the club, cutting off that head. It's so solar. It doesn't have any nuance of like, how are we actually dealing with the problem, and will it create more problems as people feel more alienated and more separate from each other and more isolated? I think that's really the danger, when things get too lopsided in one way or the other. And in this case, I think there's a real lopsidedness in the world towards the more, I'm not saying this on a personal individual horoscope level, I'm talking about the collective archetypal level, where we move more towards Capricorn in the sense of the most important thing is to, make a lot of money and get ahead in life and climb that mountain. And if you have to stomp over some people on the way, that's fine. And it's okay to lose your feeling as long as you get the riches, just like at the start of the story of the handless maiden. It's okay to get those riches. It's okay to sacrifice the maiden as long as you get those riches. It's a problem. It's a problem in the world. I don't know how to heal a problem like that, but I think it's good sometimes if we can approach it in story form and have a look at these policies. We're all coming up with these things together, and is there a way that we might be able to connect in a different way? Maybe think about the problems of the world from a deeper perspective, which actually can get back our feeling function and integrate that right all the way up into our politics and into our schools and into our infrastructure, into the world that we live in. I just think it's a really important thing. It's one to think about during this Cancer Capricorn moon. So yes, at its highest level, I believe that the element of Cancer and Capricorn is able to be, very earthly, very sensible, very logical, being able to work things out, but at the same time, being able to feel our way through as well, being able to really be heartfelt in our exploration, and being able to stay connected with the needs of each other, and pay attention to our our intuition as well. It's like part of the element of Cancer is the witch, and we've done such horrible things to the witches over the years, really devastating things. And how do we acknowledge witch wisdom again and bring that back into the consciousness and let it infiltrate, the earthy and the felt sense wisdom? How do we integrate these together? If Capricorn is the structures of the world and Cancer is the feelings of the world, how do we get them back in together, and not just have this Capricornian idea that that's all child's play, whatever, nobody cares about your feelings. It's like, yeah, okay, to an extent that can be true, if we're trying to create systems, we can't think about everybody's personal preferences or anything like that. But I think we can have, if we want to have a better world, I think the finding of the third way that combines and then builds on Cancer and Capricorn, I feel like it's a really important thing, at least to as an ideal to look towards, so that we're not just becoming full-on mountain goats, or not just becoming full-on crabs. Of course, somewhere in between progress and regress is probably that golden way. So that's my episode on Cancer and Capricorn, Puer and Senex. What did you think? What came up for you? Feel free to drop me a line on the email, or I'm on Instagram there. I post these on Instagram. You might want to drop a comment in there, and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, and see you next time with Dr. David Russell. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.